She heard the crash before she saw it. The shriek of iron tires sliding on rock, a horse screaming, then the long splintering groan of a stagecoach going over on the grade above Split Rock. Georgia Lofton dropped the coil of fence wire she'd been mending and ran toward the sound with her skirts fisted in both hands, because that was what a person did, whatever the person lying in the wreck happened to be. The coach lay on its side in the ditch, one wheel still turning slow in the air. The team had torn loose and bolted. Where the lamp oil box had burst against the rock, a thin blue flame was creeping along the spilled slick toward the splintered door, and behind that door a man was pounding and coughing and calling out in a voice already going ragged with smoke. Georgia did not stop to think about whether she was strong enough. She had buried a husband and held a homestead alone for 3 years on nothing but not stopping to think. She wrenched the twisted door until the latch gave, caught the man under both arms, and hauled backward with everything her spare frame owned. His coat had caught along one sleeve. She beat it out against the dirt with her bare palm, dragging him clear of the crawling fire foot by foot, her heels slipping in the loose shale, until they both went down hard in the sage a good 20 feet from the coach. The flame found the oil box then, and went up with a soft, heavy whump. Georgia lay over the stranger with her arm across his face, and felt the heat roll past them and thin out into the cold morning air. When she lifted her head, the man was staring at her, one eyebrow scorched, a red wheal rising along his forearm where the sleeve had burned through, but breathing, alive, blinking up at her as though she had come down out of the sky. "You're all right," she told him, which was half a question. "You're out. It can't reach you now." He tried to speak and coughed instead, and she got an arm behind his shoulders and lifted him to sitting so the smoke could clear his chest. He was a big man gone soft at the collar, dressed in a town suit worth more than her whole wagon, a gold watch chain snapped and dangling. Not a drover, not a homesteader, a money man, the kind that rode through country like this and never once got down. "My case," he rasped finally. There were papers. Papers. Georgia looked at the coach, which was now a bright, roaring shape throwing black smoke straight up into the still air. "Mister, your papers are teaching the sagebrush to read. Be glad you're not in there with them." He laughed, a cracked, disbelieving sound, and then he winced and pressed his good hand to the burned arm, and Georgia stopped scolding and got to work. She got him up the grade to her wagon, sat him in the bed with her spare quilt around him, and drove the 2 rough miles to her homestead, with him swaying against the boards behind her. She did not ask his name, and he did not offer it. There would be time. First there was the arm, which needed cool water and clean linen and a steady hand, and Georgia Lofton had all 3. Her cabin was small and swept and poor. A dead man's rifle over the door, a single chair mended with rawhide, a row of jars going thin toward the back of the shelf, because it was late summer and the season had been dry. She sat the stranger at her table and unwound what was left of his sleeve and bathed the burn, long and red and ugly, but not deep, not the kind that killed. She smeared it with the bare grease and tallow salve her mother had taught her and bound it in strips torn from her own good petticoat, because it was the cleanest cloth in the house, and a burn did not care what a woman had been saving the cloth for. "You've done this before," he said, watching her hands. "I've done everything before," Georgia said. "Out here, you do a thing once, and it's yours forever, whether you wanted it or not." She tied off the binding. "There. It'll pain you a week and scar you for good, but you'll keep the arm and the use of it." "Thaddeus Renner," he said then, as though the name were a coin he was laying on her table in payment. Georgia went still with the salve jar in her hand. She knew the name. Every soul between the divide and the river knew the name. Renner Track, the men called it. The line coming up the valley stake by stake, buying out the ones who'd sell and squeezing the ones who wouldn't, and her own quarter section sat square across the surveyed grade like a stone in a boot. She had 3 letters from the Renner Company in the trunk under her bed, each one more polite and more final than the last. The newest, naming a price that would not buy her a team of mules in a fair market. "I know your name," she said, and set the jar down harder than she meant to. "I've got it in writing 3 times. She looked at him, at the town suit, the snapped watch chain, the burn she had just dressed with her wedding petticoat. I pulled you out of that coach before I knew whose coach it was. I'd have done it the same. But you should know whose table you're sitting at, Mr. Renner. You've been trying to run me off my own ground since the frost broke. She waited for him to go hard, the way money men went hard, to name the price again, to remind her that the law and the grade and the whole weight of the company stood behind him. He only looked at the binding on his arm for a long moment. Lofton, he said slowly, the quarter section at Split Rock, that's you. He passed his good hand over his scorched eyebrow. I signed those letters. I never once thought about the woman who'd opened them. No, Georgia agreed. I don't expect you did. While she made a thin supper of eggs and fried mush, a horse came into the yard. It was Harlan Petrie, from the section east of hers, a lean, stubborn man who had gotten the same letters she had, and answered them the same way. He came to the door with his hat in his fist, and worry all over his sunburnt face, having seen the smoke on the grade from his own high pasture. Georgia, he said, I saw the fire and thought. Then he saw the man at her table, saw the town suit and the bound arm, and his face closed like a slammed drawer. That's Renner, he said flatly. That's the Renner that's driving us all off. You know that? You know whose burn you just dressed? I know it now, Georgia said. I didn't when I hauled him out. And I'd not have left any man to cook in a ditch, Harlan. Not for all the track in the territory. Sit down or ride home, but do it quiet. He's had a hard morning. Harlan did not sit. He looked a long moment at Renner, who had gone very still, and then he said the thing that was in all their throats that whole dry summer. My grandfather broke that ground. My father's buried in it. And a man in a train car 300 miles off draws a line through it and it's gone. Like it never was ours at all. He put his hat back on. You saved the wrong man, Georgia. And he rode off into the dusk. The words sat in the little room a long time after the hoofbeats faded. Renner looked at his own bound arm as though it belonged to a stranger. He stayed the night because he had no other place to be, and no coach to carry him, and because a man with a fresh burn and a lungful of smoke had no business on the road in the dark. Georgia gave him the mended chair and the fire, and took the stool for herself, and in the low light he asked her, awkward, unpracticed at it, about the place, how long, how alone, what her husband had died of. She told him about the fever winter that took Robert Lofton and the 2 seasons after, when she'd learned to do a man's work with a woman's hands, because there was no one left to do it for her. She told him what the section had cost her, and what it was worth, which were not the same number, and never had been. She answered plainly, because she had never learned any other way, and she watched something in the big, soft-collared man come slowly apart and put itself back together different. The grade doesn't have to run across your ground, he said into the coals, near midnight. It was drawn that way because a surveyor's straight line is cheaper than a curved one, cheaper by a few $100s. He looked at the flame. I have spent my whole life making the line straight and cheap. I never stood in the house it ran through. It runs through a good many houses, Georgia said. Yes, he said, it does. In the morning, she drove him to the way station at the crossing, where the company would send men and money and a new coach, all the machinery of a man who owned every mile of the track she hated. She expected that would be the last of him, that Thaddeus Renner would go back to the world where lines were straight and cheap, and that the 4th letter would come, and the 5th, until she was worn down to selling. The 4th letter came 11 days later. Georgia carried it in from the mailbox with her jaw set, and stood in the yard, and made herself open it. It was not from the company, it was from the man. The grade would be resurveyed to curve south of the creek, the letter said, clear of her section, and clear of 3 neighbors besides. The cost was his to answer for, and no one else's. Folded inside was the deed to her quarter section, the old cloud on the title, a lien the company had bought up years back and held over her like a raised hand, marked paid and canceled in a firm town hand. And beneath that, in different ink, slower, as though written and set down and taken up again, I have dressed the arm you bound. The scar is coming in the shape of your hand. I find I do not mind it. If a man who owns too much track and understood too little of the country it crosses might call on you when next I ride the valley, I would take it as a kindness I have not earned." Georgia read it twice, standing in the yard, and then she went inside and did not answer it for 2 days, because she did not trust the thing that had come up warm in her chest. He rode the valley in September, on a good horse, in an old coat instead of the town suit, the sleeve rolled to show the long pale scar healing white against his forearm. He got down at her gate. He got down, which the plan had said money men never did, and he stood turning his hat in his hands like a boy. "I brought the curve," he said. "It's staked south of the creek. You'll hear the crews in a month, but you won't see them from your window. Petrie's section is clear too, and the Danes, and the widow Cobb's at the ford. I rode to each of them and said it to their faces, which I should have done a year ago instead of hiding behind letters." He turned the hat another slow half-circle. "Petrie didn't shake my hand. But he didn't shut the door either. That's a good deal more than I have earned off any one of you." He hesitated. "And I brought this." He held out a small crate. Inside were 4 laying hens, and a speckled rooster, brown and indignant, complaining loudly at the indignity of the journey. "Your shelf was going thin, I noticed. I've thought about that shelf every day since." Georgia looked at the hens, and at the scar shaped like her own hand, and at the big, humbled man who had learned to get down off his horse. "You'd best come in, Mr. Renner," she said. "The coffee's poor and the chair still bites. But you pulled a curve out of a straight line for me, and I find I don't mind feeding a man who can learn." He came in. He came in that September, and he came again in October with glass for her one window, and a milk cow led behind. And by the first snow he was mending the rawhide chair he had sat in the night she saved him, and Georgia stood in her own doorway on ground that was hers free and clear, and watched the man who had owned every mile of the track she hated split her winter wood as though he had been born to it. They married in the spring, in the little church at the crossing, with the scar of her hand on his arm for a wedding band that no ring could better, and in the years after, when the trains ran at last up the valley, on a line that curved south of the creek, and left her homestead its morning quiet, Georgia Lofton Renner would hear the far whistle in the dark, and reach across the warm bed for the hand of the man she had dragged from the fire, the man who had learned, too late to be proud of it, and just in time to be loved, that a straight line is a cheap thing, and a woman who runs toward the burning coach is the dearest thing a fortune ever bought and never could.